Welcome back to the nervous system. In this lecture, we return to Chapter 13 to focus on somatic reflexes. Let's begin by defining the term reflex. We've all heard this term before, but what does it really mean? What comes to mind when you hear the word reflex? Reflexes are defined as quick, involuntary, stereotyped reactions of glands or muscles to stimulation. If we examine this definition, we see that it sums up four important properties of reflexes. First, reflexes require stimulation. They are not spontaneous actions, but rather are responses to some form of sensory input. Second, reflexes are quick. Based on what we learned in the last lecture, do you know what this tells us about the neural pathways used in reflexes? If you remembered that the use of chemical synapses to relay information from one neuron to another results in a synaptic delay, this may have helped you to realize that the more neurons, the more synapses that are involved in a pathway, the longer it will take for the signal to reach its destination. Therefore, for reflexes to be quick means that they must involve as few neurons as possible. Specifically, these pathways will use very few interneurons, and sometimes they don't use interneurons at all. The third property of reflexes is that they are involuntary, meaning of course that they are not intentional, but rather automatic responses to sensory input. These reflexes often occur without our awareness, and they are usually difficult to suppress. It is important to note that even when we are aware of the stimulus, that awareness is not part of the reflex itself, which is why we may become aware of the stimulus as the reflex is happening, or even after it is completed. It also explains why reflexes can still occur even if the spinal cord has been severed. It is not necessary for information regarding the stimulus to reach the brain in order for the reflex to occur. And lastly, reflexes are stereotyped, meaning that they occur essentially the same way every time. The response is predictable. Although reflexes can involve secretions from glands, contraction of cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle, and can even include some learned responses referred to as conditioned reflexes, this chapter deals with unlearned skeletal muscle reflexes. Some books refer to these reflexes as spinal reflexes. However, as your book points out, reflexes involving the skeletal muscles are sometimes mediated by the brain, and additionally, visceral reflexes also involve the spinal cord. So the term somatic reflexes is more accurate and indicates that these skeletal muscle reflexes involve the somatic nervous system. The pathway that the signal follows in these reflexes is referred to as a reflex arc. Based on what we have discussed in the previous lecture, can you predict what pathway the signal will follow for a somatic reflex? You may want to pause this video here and see if you can sketch out the pathway. You may have sketched out a pathway that looks something like this. A reflex arc involves 5 major components. First, a receptor, in this case a somatic receptor located in the skin, muscles, or tendons, detects a stimulus. A sensory or afferent neuron then carries this information from the receptor in the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system. This will usually involve a unipolar neuron whose cell body is located in the dorsal root ganglia, and the signal will pass through the spinal nerve and through the dorsal root into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. However, in some cases, the afferent neuron may enter into the brain rather than the spinal cord. Once the signal has reached the end of the sensory neuron, the axon will synapse onto another neuron within the central nervous system. This point of synaptic contact between neurons in the gray matter of the spinal cord or the brain is referred to as an integrating center, since, as we are well aware by now, whenever a neuron forms a chemical synapse with another neuron, it has the ability to integrate information from multiple sources. The neuron that this sensory neuron synapses onto is often an interneuron, also known as an association neuron, which resides entirely within the central nervous system. Reflex arcs can include one or more interneurons. However, remember that the more synapses that occur in a reflex arc, the more time that will be required for the signal to travel through the pathway due to the synaptic delay. Therefore, some reflex arcs do not contain any interneurons. The interneuron, or the sensory neuron if there is no interneuron, will then synapse onto a motor neuron, also known as an efferent neuron. The cell body of this efferent neuron usually resides in the ventral horn of the spinal cord gray matter. The axon of this motor neuron projects out of the central nervous system, usually traveling through the ventral root, and innervates the effector. In the case of somatic reflexes, these efferent neurons are responsible for carrying motor impulses to the skeletal muscle. The skeletal muscle, the effector, then carries out the response. While we have previously discussed the structure and function of afferent neurons, interneurons, efferent neurons, and skeletal muscles, we have not yet discussed receptors in much detail, except to say that they are responsible for detecting a stimulus. There are different types of stimuli that can induce a somatic reflex, and different types of receptors can be utilized to detect these various stimuli. We will discuss several examples in this lecture. We will begin with a class of receptors known as proprioceptors, which are specialized sense organs that monitor the position and movement of body parts. There are two major types of proprioceptors that we are going to discuss in this lecture: muscle spindles and tendon organs. A muscle spindle is a stretch receptor embedded into the skeletal muscles. They are responsible for informing the brain of muscle length and body movement, which enables the brain to send motor commands back to the skeletal muscles that control coordinated movement, corrective reflexes, muscle tone, and posture. In this image, we can see that the majority of the muscle is composed of those striated skeletal muscle fibers that we examined in great detail in the previous module. Here, we refer to those cells as extrafusal fibers because they are outside of the muscle spindle. Not surprisingly, those cells that are located inside of the muscle spindle are referred to as intrafusal fibers. These intrafusal fibers are actually modified muscle cells. Unlike extrafusal muscle cells, these intrafusal muscle cells only have sarcomeres and therefore contractile ability at either end of the cell, not in the middle. In addition to having two major classes of muscle fibers, there are also two major classes of nerve fibers, which innervate those muscle fibers. Motor nerve fibers, which are responsible for carrying information to the muscles from the central nervous system, and sensory nerve fibers, which are responsible for carrying information away from the muscles to the central nervous system. Since our focus on this slide is the muscle spindle, which is a sense organ, let's begin with the sensory nerve fibers. There are two subtypes of sensory nerve fibers which originate in the muscle spindle and carry sensory information to the central nervous system. There is one large, fast nerve fiber that coils around the middle of the intrafusal fibers, known as the primary afferent fiber. These fibers are very sensitive to small changes in muscle length and to sudden body movements. In addition to the one primary afferent fiber, there are up to 8 intermediate-sized, slower-conducting nerve fibers that are known as secondary afferent fibers. These secondary fibers wind primarily around the ends of the intrafusal fibers and convey information regarding muscle length, but they are far less responsive to the rate of length change. As for the motor nerve fibers, there are two subtypes of these fibers as well, both of which originate in the central nervous system and carry motor information to the muscle cells. When we discussed neuromuscular junctions in the previous module, and we learned that motor nerve fibers innervate skeletal muscle cells and cause them to contract by releasing acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft, it was large, fast fibers known as alpha motor neurons which we were discussing. Here we can see that these alpha motor neurons innervate the extrafusal muscle fibers and can cause them to contract. However, there is another class of motor nerve fibers. These fibers innervate the intrafusal muscle fibers, those modified muscle cells that are located inside of the muscle spindle. These are referred to as gamma motor neurons. Unlike the alpha motor neurons, these gamma motor neurons have a smaller diameter and are therefore slower. Remember that the intrafusal fibers only have sarcomeres at the end of the cells, not the middle. Therefore, when these gamma motor neuron fibers signal these modified muscle cells, only the ends are able to contract. You may be asking yourself, if the muscle spindle is a sense organ, why is it innervated by motor neurons? Why do the intrafusal fibers need to contract at all? The short answer is that by stimulating the contractile ends of these intrafusal fibers to shorten, it allows the sensitivity of the muscle spindle to be adjusted. To understand what this really means, let's examine how these muscle spindles function. In this image, we can see that the muscle is unstretched and it is relaxed, and the sensory nerves of the muscle spindle are firing at a constant rate, as is indicated by the black lines in the yellow rectangle at the bottom. Keep in mind that the muscle spindle is a stretch receptor. Therefore, when the muscle becomes stretched, the sensory afferent neurons of the muscle spindle increase their rate of firing, as indicated by the fact that there are more black lines in the yellow rectangle at the bottom and less space between each line. This increase in action potential frequency indicates to the central nervous system that the muscle had been stretched. However, what happens when the opposite occurs? What happens when the muscle contracts, when it shortens? In this image, we can see that if only the extrafusal muscle fibers, the typical striated skeletal muscle cells, are stimulated to contract by the alpha motor neurons, then the intrafusal fibers inside of the muscle spindle become scrunched up. Therefore, the sensory neurons wrapped around the intrafusal fibers of the muscle spindle do not send any action potentials. Therefore, the muscle spindle is unable to relay information regarding changes in length to the central nervous system. Since the major function of the muscles is to contract, this is obviously a problem. Do you have any guesses as to how this problem can be remedied? If you realized that it had something to do with the gamma motor neurons, which innervate the intrafusal muscle fibers of the muscle spindle, congratulations, you're right. Since the inability of sensory neurons of the muscle spindle to signal is not beneficial to the body, this is fortunately not what usually happens. Remember that although intrafusal muscle fibers are primarily sense organs and lack striations and therefore the ability to contract along most of their length, they are striated and do have the ability to contract at either end when signaled to do so by the gamma motor neurons. In this image, we see that the extrafusal muscle fibers are being stimulated to contract by the alpha motor neurons. But you will also notice that the sensory neurons wrapped around the intrafusal fibers are once again firing action potentials. This is because the gamma motor neurons are being co-activated along with the alpha motor neurons. If the gamma motor neurons stimulate the ends of the intrafusal fibers within the muscle spindle to contract, whenever the alpha motor neurons stimulate the extrafusal muscle fibers to contract, this helps keep the muscle spindles taut and allows the sensory neurons wrapped around the intrafusal fibers to continue to respond to changes in length. If you are still somewhat confused as to why a sensory organ needs to be innervated by motor neurons and needs to be able to contract, think of it this way. Let's pretend we want to convey a message to someone in another room by ringing a bell. It is necessary to keep the string taut so that when you pull on the string, it results in the movement of the bell, causing it to ring out. If the string is not kept taut, then when you pull on the string, it will only move the string, and it will not result in the ringing of the bell. The signal will not be relayed to the other person. In the same way, the gamma motor neurons are necessary to keep the intrafusal fibers inside of the muscle spindle taut, so that they can respond to changes in length of the muscle and relay this information to the central nervous system. Now that we have examined the basic structure and function of muscle spindles, let's look at an example of how these proprioceptors are used in somatic reflexes. When a muscle is stretched, it tends to fight back and contracts, thereby maintaining muscle tone. This is known as a stretch reflex. This reflex helps to maintain equilibrium and posture, such as when our head tips forward and the muscles at the back of the neck contract, raising our head back up. Additionally, this reflex also helps to stabilize joints by balancing the tension in extensors and flexors and thereby smoothing muscle actions. Since the stretch reflex is mediated primarily by the brain, it is not strictly a spinal reflex, but the spinal component can be more pronounced if a muscle is stretched very suddenly, as occurs in a tendon reflex. There are many examples of tendon reflexes. However, the example we are most familiar with is the patellar reflex, or the knee-jerk reflex. As we are aware, tapping the ligament at the knee causes our lower leg to jerk. This is because tapping the patellar ligament excites the afferent nerve endings wrapped around the intrafusal fiber of the muscle spindle within the quadriceps femoris, and causes them to increase the frequency at which they fire. The action potentials travel to the spinal cord via the primary afferent neuron, whose cell body is located in the dorsal root ganglia. The signal follows along the axon of this sensory neuron, which passes through the spinal nerves, through the dorsal root, and enters the gray matter in the spinal cord. Here, in this integrating center, the afferent neuron synapses onto and stimulates the alpha motor neuron in the spinal cord, shown in red. The axon of this efferent neuron projects out of the spinal cord and innervates the quadriceps femoris. Therefore, when an action potential is sent along this motor neuron, it stimulates the quadriceps femoris to contract. Do you remember what the primary function of the quadriceps femoris muscles are? If you said knee extension, you're right. Therefore, activation of these muscles produces the knee jerk. Since this reflex arc only involves two neurons, a sensory neuron, which synapses directly onto a motor neuron, with only a single synapse in between them, it is referred to as a monosynaptic reflex arc. However, you may have noticed in the integration center in the spinal cord that the axon of the primary afferent neuron also synapses onto another neuron, an interneuron, shown in purple. Do you have any guesses as to why this would occur? Hopefully, you will remember from the previous module that the prime mover in a muscle action often has an antagonist that opposes the action. This may have helped you to realize that this antagonist must be inhibited at the same time that the prime mover is stimulated, or otherwise it may prevent the reflex action from occurring. In this case, do you remember what the antagonist of the quadriceps femoris is? In other words, what muscles are involved in knee flexion rather than knee extension? If you remembered that it was the hamstring muscles, congratulations, you're right. It's important to remember that skeletal muscles can only be depolarized, excited, by the release of the acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. Therefore, in order to inhibit the hamstring muscles, the alpha motor neuron which innervates these muscles must be inhibited instead. Notice that in the integration center of the spinal cord, where the purple interneuron synapses onto the blue motor neuron that leads to the hamstrings, there is a tiny red circle with a negative symbol, as opposed to the tiny green circles with positive symbols that are present at the other synapses. This red circle with the negative symbol indicates that the release of the neurotransmitter from the interneuron onto the blue motor neuron will result in an IPSP, an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, in the motor neuron. In other words, it inhibits the motor neuron by hyperpolarizing it and making it less likely that the motor neuron will fire an action potential. This will prevent the hamstring muscles from being activated while the quadriceps muscles are being activated. This process is known as reciprocal inhibition. Since this reflex arc leading to the hamstring muscles involves three neurons, a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and a motor neuron, and two synapses in between these neurons, it is an example of a polysynaptic reflex arc. The second type of proprioceptors we are going to discuss are tendon organs. Given their name, it should not be surprising that these proprioceptors are located in tendons. They are an encapsulated bundle of small, loose collagen fibers, which contain one or more sensory nerve fibers located between these collagen fibers. When the muscle is relaxed, the tendon is slack, and the collagen fibers are slightly spread apart, and little pressure is put on the nerve endings. However, when the muscle contracts, it pulls on the tendon, and the collagen fibers move closer together and apply pressure to the nerve endings between them, which will cause them to send action potentials along their axons to the central nervous system. In this way, the tendon organ is able to inform the central nervous system about the degree of muscle tension at a joint. These tendon organs are involved in tendon reflexes, whose primary purpose is to prevent muscles from contracting too strongly. As we discussed in the previous module, muscles are actually capable of exerting more force than the tendons or even the bones can withstand. Therefore, in response to excessive tension on a tendon, in this example the tendon of the quadriceps femoris, the tendon organ sends sensory information to the central nervous system via an afferent nerve fiber. When this axon reaches the integrating center within the spinal cord, it will synapse onto an inhibitory interneuron, which will cause inhibition of the alpha motor neuron innervating the muscle the tendon is attached to. in this example the quadriceps femoris, thereby lessening the force of the muscle contraction before it results in a torn tendon or other kind of damage. In this example, inhibiting the extension of the knee caused by the quadriceps femoris. As we discussed in the previous slide, the prime mover in a muscle action often has an antagonist that opposes that action. And as we also mentioned, the antagonists of the quadriceps femoris are the hamstring muscles. Therefore, in addition to inhibiting the muscle which has been contracting and applying too much tension to the tendon, in this case the quadriceps femoris, it is also important to activate those muscles which are antagonistic to this action, in this case the hamstring muscles. This is known as reciprocal activation. As we have mentioned, there are different types of stimuli that can cause a somatic reflex, and different types of receptors can be utilized to detect these stimuli. In addition to proprioceptors, pain receptors can be involved in initiating somatic reflexes. The flexor reflex, also known as the withdrawal reflex, involves quick contraction of a flexor muscle, resulting in the withdrawal of a limb from a stimulus which can cause injury and pain. In this reflex, pain receptors are stimulated. Sensory neurons carry this information to the central nervous system and synapses onto interneurons, which causes the contraction of flexors and the relaxation of extensors in the injured limb. Although this is an example of a polysynaptic reflex arc, with multiple synapses and neurons involved, as with all reflexes, this withdrawal reflex is very quick. The speed at which the signal travels through this reflex arc is evident in the fact that we have often begun pulling our injured limb away from the stimulus before we have even become consciously aware of the pain. So far, all of the reflex arcs we have seen, including this flexor reflex, are ipsilateral reflex arcs. What do you think this means? If you said that it refers to the fact that the sensory input and motor output are on the same side of the spinal cord, you're right. However, in this image, we can see that there are also contralateral reflex arcs, in which the sensory input and motor output are on opposite sides of the spinal cord. Do you have any guesses as to why sensory neurons involved in the flexor reflex would not only result in the activation and inhibition of motor neurons on the same side of the body as the stimulus, but also cause the activation and inhibition of motor neurons on the opposite side? You may have realized that if we only flexed the leg that was injured to pull it away from the stimulus, without ensuring that our other leg was extended, then we run the risk of falling on our face. Therefore, a contralateral reflex arc, known as the cross-extensor reflex, is used by the body to maintain balance during the flexor reflex. This cross-extension reflex results in the contraction of the extensor muscles and the relaxation of the flexor muscles in the limb opposite of the one that is being withdrawn. That brings us to the end of this lecture, and to the end of Chapter 13. We are now halfway through the nervous system. In the next lecture, we will return to the nervous system to begin our study of the brain and the cranial nerves. If you have any questions, please post them on the discussion forum. Have a good day.